September 4th, 1944, 0847 hours, Wehrmacht Intelligence Section, 7th Army Headquarters near Nancy, France. The coffee was ersatz, bitter with roasted acorns, and it left a film on the tongue that no amount of water could wash away. Major Klaus Brenner set the chipped porcelain cup on the edge of his makeshift desk, a door laid across two ammunition crates, and studied the aerial reconnaissance photograph with the intensity of a man searching for hope in a losing hand. The image showed a single-lane road east of Chartres, and on that road, stretching back toward the horizon in a gray-black thread, were trucks, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands. The photograph had been taken 3 days earlier by a Luftwaffe reconnaissance plane that never returned from its mission. And now Brenner held one of the last images captured by a dead pilot over a dying front. "They cannot possibly sustain this," Brenner said aloud. Though he was alone in the room, the walls were thin canvas, and outside he could hear the rumble of German vehicles retreating eastward, away from the Americans who had broken out of Normandy and were now racing across France with a speed that defied every principle of military logistics Brenner had studied at the War Academy. An army moved on its stomach. Napoleon had said, and armies this large. American Third Army alone numbered over 300,000 men, required rail lines, depots, carefully orchestrated supply dumps built over months of preparation. The Americans had none of this. They had left their railheads 200 miles behind. Their supply lines stretched back through the ruins of the Atlantic Wall, through the cratered moonscape of the Norman hedgerows, through ports that German engineers had systematically demolished before surrender. By every calculation Brenner and his colleagues had made, Patton's army should have ground to a halt in mid-August, starved of fuel and ammunition and food. Instead, they were accelerating. The report on his desk, compiled from interrogations of American prisoners and intercepted radio traffic, contained a claim so absurd that Brenner's immediate superior had laughed when he first read it. The Americans were running a motor transport operation they called the Red Ball Express. According to the report, this operation consisted of truck convoys running 24 hours per day in a continuous loop from the Normandy beaches to the advancing front lines, carrying everything an army needed to fight: gasoline in 5-gallon jerry cans, artillery shells in wooden crates, K rations in cardboard boxes, medical supplies, spare parts, cigarettes, mail, even Coca-Cola. The trucks traveled on roads reserved exclusively for this traffic, roads from which all civilian vehicles and even regular military transport had been banned. The convoys moved with headlights blazing even at night, protected by air superiority so complete that the Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force over France. Oberst Dietrich Mannheim had read the report over Brenner's shoulder 2 days earlier and snorted with derision. 24 hours? They expect us to believe this fantasy? Mannheim had spent 4 years on the Eastern Front, where German logistics had consisted of horse-drawn wagons struggling through mud, where ammunition shortages decided battles, where entire divisions went hungry because the trains from Germany arrived late, or not at all. Motor transport consumes more fuel than it carries over distances like this. The mathematics do not work. The Americans are lying to their own men to maintain morale. But the trucks in the photograph were not lying. Brenner had counted them, section by section, using a magnifying glass and a methodical grid system. In one 5-mile stretch of road, he had identified 147 vehicles, extrapolating along the visible portion of the route, conservatively estimating traffic density. The number became staggering. If the photograph represented even a fraction of the operation's scale, if this was happening not just on one road but on multiple routes simultaneously, if it continued not just for hours but for days and weeks without pause, then the Americans were moving supplies in quantities that Brenner's training told him were impossible. He pulled another document from his stack, a translation of an article from Stars and Stripes, the American military newspaper, recovered from a captured supply truck. The article, written in the breezy, confident tone that characterized American propaganda, described the Red Ball Express in terms that seemed designed to mock German intelligence analysts. 6,000 trucks rolling day and night. The article claimed, drivers sleeping in shifts, 340 miles round trip, 12,000 tons of supplies delivered every 24 hours. 12,000 tons. Brenner did the arithmetic in his head. That was enough to feed an entire Army Corps with surplus left over. That was enough to keep tank divisions fueled for continuous operations. That was enough to make strategic calculations based on logistics, the calculations upon which German defensive planning now depended, utterly meaningless. In the corner of the tent, a telegraph machine clattered to life, and Brenner watched the paper ribbon emerge with its encoded message from Army Group B headquarters. He did not need to decode it to know what it would say. Another town fallen. Another river crossed. Another defensive position abandoned because there was no fuel to move the tanks. No ammunition to fight a sustained engagement. No reserves to plug the gaps. The Americans were not advancing with tactical brilliance or operational genius. They were advancing because they had turned warfare into an industrial process. A mathematical equation where their side possessed infinite terms and the German side was dividing by zero. Brenner understood this intellectually, had understood it since the factories of the Ruhr began dying under British bombs. But understanding and accepting were different things. He returned to the photograph, to those tiny gray shapes frozen in their relentless march eastward. Somewhere in that column was the mathematics that would end the war, not in a general's strategy or a soldier's courage, but in the prosaic brutality of trucks and gasoline, and the willingness to waste resources on a scale that the German military, even at the height of its power, had never imagined. Brenner had spent 3 years helping to calculate supply requirements for Wehrmacht operations. 3 years learning that war was not glory and heroism, but tons and kilometers and calories per man per day. He had believed that this knowledge gave him insight, that logistics was the secret language of warfare, the truth beneath the propaganda. Now, studying the evidence of an enemy who had industrialized logistics itself, who had built a system that operated with the mindless efficiency of a factory assembly line, Brenner felt a cold certainty settling in his chest like the ersatz coffee. The Americans had not just solved the problem of supply, they had eliminated it as a limiting factor. They had created abundance where there should have been scarcity, had manufactured momentum where friction should have ground them to a halt. And if they could do this here, on roads that German forces had destroyed, across distances that should have been prohibitive, then there was no defensive line deep enough, no strategic calculation safe enough, to stop them. The canvas wall of the tent snapped in a sudden gust of wind, and Brenner tasted dust in the air. The dry residue of a summer that had seen France torn apart for the second time in a generation. The engine heat came through the floorboards in waves that made the metal pedals too hot to touch with bare feet. But Technical Sergeant Raymond Porter kept his boots on despite the August sun that turned the cab of the GMC CCKW into a mobile oven. The truck in front of him, visible through the cracked windshield and the dust that no amount of washing could remove, carried its cargo of 5-gallon jerry cans stacked 6 high and 4 deep, each can filled with 80-octane gasoline that would be burning in a Sherman tank's engine somewhere near the German border by this time tomorrow. Porter's truck carried the same cargo, and the truck behind him, and the truck behind that one, extending back in a line that Porter had stopped trying to count 3 days ago when he realized the column had no visible end, just disappeared into the heat shimmer and dust cloud that marked the road stretching back toward Normandy. His co-driver, Private First Class Jimmy Chen from San Francisco, was asleep in the passenger seat with his helmet tipped over his eyes and his mouth open, snoring despite the rattling and bouncing that made every bolt and rivet in the 2.5-ton truck announce its presence. They had been driving for 16 hours with 2 10-minute breaks for fuel and latrine calls, and Chen had learned to sleep through anything, including the moment 2 hours earlier when Porter had swerved to avoid a French civilian's cart that had somehow gotten onto the Red Ball route, despite the MPs posted every 5 miles to keep the highway clear. The near miss had sent jerry cans sliding and clanking in the truck bed. But Chen had simply adjusted his helmet and continued snoring. And Porter had felt a flash of envy for men who could find unconsciousness so easily. The speedometer read 35 miles per hour, which was the mandated speed for loaded trucks on this section of road. And Porter maintained it with the precision of a man who knew that the MPs had stopwatches and clipboards and would write up any driver who deviated from the schedule. 35 miles per hour, no faster, no slower. Hour after hour until the numbers lost meaning and became simply the rhythm of the engine and the feel of the wheel under his hands. Behind him, in the endless column, other drivers maintained the same speed in their identical trucks carrying identical cargo. And the effect, Porter thought when exhaustion made him philosophical, was like being a single blood cell in an artery, pushed along by a heart too large to comprehend, serving a body whose full dimensions were beyond his understanding. He had been driving Red Ball routes for 3 weeks. Since mid-August, when the operation had begun in response to the breakout from Normandy and the sudden, unexpected collapse of German resistance across northwestern France, the briefing had been short and delivered by a captain who looked like he had not slept in days. Drive to the forward depots. Unload. Drive back. Reload. Repeat. 24 hours a day, no exceptions, no excuses. You are the supply line, the captain had said. You are why Third Army can advance 50 miles in a day. You are why we will be in Germany by Christmas. Do not crash your truck. Do not lose your cargo. Do not stop except at designated points. Everything else is secondary. Porter had thought the captain was exaggerating for motivational purposes, the way officers did when they needed men to accept dangerous or unpleasant assignments. Then he had driven his first run and understood that the captain had been describing literal fact. The Red Ball Express was not one of the supply mechanisms supporting the advance across France. It was the mechanism, singular, upon which the entire operation depended. The railroads were destroyed. The ports were wrecked. The distances were too great for conventional depot-to-depot transport. So the Army had done something that seemed insane until you saw it working. They had turned truck transport itself into a railroad, complete with fixed routes and schedules and traffic control. And they had scaled it to a size that made individual trucks irrelevant, made individual drivers interchangeable components in a machine that operated according to tonnage tables and fuel consumption calculations and delivery schedules measured in thousands of vehicles per day. At the briefing, a logistics lieutenant had rattled off numbers that Porter had written in his notebook and later studied in his tent, trying to make them feel real. 6,000 trucks committed to the operation, with more arriving from England every day. 540 miles of one-way route from St. Lo to forward supply dumps, doubled because trucks needed to return empty for reloading, making the effective distance over 1,000 miles of managed highway. Convoys running continuously, with trucks entering the route every few minutes around the clock. Targets of 12,000 tons delivered per day, expandable to 20,000 tons when Third Army's advance demanded it. Fuel consumption of the convoy itself calculated at 300,000 gallons per day, meaning the trucks collectively burned enough gasoline to keep several armored divisions mobile. And this was considered acceptable overhead, even desirable, because trucks running on roads could deliver supplies faster and more flexibly than trains running on tracks that German engineers had spent 4 years learning to destroy efficiently. Chen stirred in his sleep and muttered something that might have been a woman's name or might have been a request for food. Porter could not tell and did not ask. They would reach the forward dump in another 90 minutes if the road remained clear. Would unload in 20 minutes with the help of the quartermaster troops who did nothing but unload Red Ball trucks from dawn to dawn. Would grab coffee and a sandwich from the mess tent that operated on shifts to keep Red Ball drivers fed. And then would turn around and drive back toward the coast with their empty truck, joining the southbound lane of the highway where other empty trucks flowed like a river running backward, returning to Normandy to collect more fuel, more ammunition, more food, more of everything an army needed to continue existing hundreds of miles from its supply base. The sound was what struck First Lieutenant Werner Schultz first, even before his eyes had fully adjusted to the pale pre-dawn light, filtering through the canvas flap of the tent where he and 14 other German prisoners had spent the night under American guard. It was a mechanical roar, constant and layered, the noise of dozens, no, hundreds, of truck engines idling and revving and shifting gears. A sound so pervasive that it seemed to come from the earth itself rather than from any specific source. Schultz had been captured 4 days earlier near Verdun when his infantry company, out of ammunition and surrounded, had surrendered to American tanks that appeared with a speed that suggested teleportation rather than conventional movement. He had expected a prison camp, interrogation, the slow bureaucratic process of becoming a statistic in the war's accounting. Instead, The Americans had brought him here, to what they called a supply point, and had put him to work. The American sergeant who supervised the prisoner work detail was a thick-shouldered man from Pennsylvania named Kowalski, who spoke no German but communicated effectively through gestures and the occasional well-placed shove. He had herded Schultz and the other prisoners out of their tent and across a field that 3 months earlier had probably grown wheat, but now was packed earth scored with tire tracks and littered with empty wooden crates and discarded fuel cans. The field extended for perhaps 800 meters in every direction, and every square meter of it was devoted to the business of supply. Fuel dumps with jerry cans stacked in pyramids 20 feet high, ammunition bunkers roofed with sandbags and camouflage netting, mountains of ration cartons arranged in gridded rows like city blocks, maintenance areas where mechanics worked on trucks with their hoods raised and parts scattered on canvas ground sheets and everywhere, and dominating everything. The trucks themselves, they arrived in a stream that never stopped, pulling into designated unloading zones where other prisoner work details and American quartermaster troops descended on them with the coordinated efficiency of factory workers on an assembly line. A truck would halt, its engine still running, and within seconds men would be in the truck bed, passing down crates and cartons and jerry cans in a human chain that terminated at the appropriate storage area. The American in charge of each unloading zone, usually a corporal or sergeant, would check items against a manifest, mark something on a clipboard, and wave the truck forward. The entire process took between 12 and 18 minutes. Schultz had timed it yesterday, and then the empty truck would pull away and join the outbound lane of the highway while another loaded truck took its place. And the process would begin again, endlessly, mechanically, without pause or variation. Schultz had been an officer in the Wehrmacht for 5 years, had studied logistics at the academy in Berlin, had personally overseen supply operations for his battalion during the retreat from the Soviet Union, where every bullet and every potato was precious and accounted for and fought over. He understood military supply as a problem of scarcity, of making careful choices about what to transport and what to leave behind, of rationing and prioritization and the terrible mathematics of triage. What he was witnessing here inverted every principle he had learned. The Americans did not ration. They oversupplied. They did not prioritize. They delivered everything. They did not calculate minimum requirements. They calculated maximum capacity and then exceeded it. A truck pulled into the zone where Schultz's detail was working, and Kowalski pointed at the truck bed and then at the prisoners. And Schultz climbed up and began passing down wooden crates marked with U.S. Army stenciling. The crates contained K rations, the American field ration that came in waxed cardboard boxes and provided 3 meals per day per soldier. Schultz handed down crate after crate, counting automatically, and reached 40 before the truck bed was empty. 40 crates, each containing 48 ration boxes, each box feeding 1 soldier for 1 day. 1,920 soldier days of food in a single truck. And Schultz had watched at least 200 trucks unload since dawn yesterday, and the sergeant in charge of the ration dump had told him through a translator that this was a slow day, that when Third Army was advancing rapidly, they sometimes handled 400 trucks in a 24-hour period. The mathematics became oppressive when Schultz allowed himself to calculate it fully. 400 trucks per day at this one supply point, each carrying an average of perhaps 6 tons of cargo, meant 2,400 tons per day delivered to a single forward depot. And there were multiple depots, spaced along the front to support different corps and divisions, each receiving its own stream of trucks from the Red Ball routes. The total tonnage being delivered daily to American forces in France exceeded anything the Wehrmacht had moved even during major offensives on the Eastern Front. And the Americans were doing it not as a special effort for a critical operation, but as routine, sustainable, normal procedure. "Move faster," Kowalski said. Or at least that was what Schultz assumed he meant from the sergeant's tone and the way he pointed at the next truck pulling into position. Schultz moved faster, and beside him a young Austrian corporal named Hartmann whispered in German, "Where does it all come from? How can they have so much?" Schultz had no answer, but the question had haunted him since his capture. The Americans he had fought against in Normandy had been brave enough, competent enough, but not noticeably superior to German soldiers in training or tactics. Their tanks were adequate but not exceptional. Their artillery was effective but not revolutionary. Their infantry fought well but made mistakes, took casualties, retreated when pressed hard. In every tactical engagement Schultz had witnessed or heard about, German units had performed as well or better than their American counterparts. Man for man, weapon for weapon. And yet the Americans were winning, were advancing across France at a pace that made German defensive planning impossible. And the reason was visible in every truck that rumbled into this supply point with its cargo of abundance. Colonel Henry Walsh stood before a map of France that covered an entire wall of the requisitioned schoolhouse classroom and traced the red line that marked the primary red ball route with his finger. Following it from the beach depots at Utah Beach through the ruined towns of the Cotentin Peninsula, past the cratered moonscape around Saint-Lô where the breakout had begun, eastward through Alençon and Chartres and on toward the front lines that shifted eastward every day by increments that made the map outdated almost as soon as the pins were moved. The line was over 300 miles long now and growing longer, and Walsh felt a pride mixed with terror at what he and his staff had created in the space of 3 weeks. A logistical system so vast and so dependent on continuous operation that its failure would not merely slow the American advance, but halt it completely. Strand Third Army in the middle of France with no fuel and no ammunition and no food. Turn tactical success into strategic catastrophe. The system had begun as an emergency measure into improvised in response to a crisis that no one had fully anticipated. The Allied planning for the Normandy invasion had assumed a methodical advance, with armies moving forward only as fast as engineers could repair railroads and reopen ports, with supply lines extending gradually from secure rear areas to frontline units according to carefully calculated schedules. But the German defense had collapsed faster than expected, and General Patton had seized the opportunity to drive his Third Army across France at speeds that outran every logistical projection. And suddenly the careful planning meant nothing, because the advancing units were 100 miles beyond the nearest functioning railroad and consuming supplies faster than any conventional transport system could deliver them. Walsh had received the assignment on August 3rd from a 2-star general who had handed him a folder containing tonnage requirements and distance calculations, and a single typed sentence that served as his mission statement: "Make it work or we lose the war." The general had not been exaggerating. Without fuel, Third Army's tank divisions would become immobile pillboxes. Without ammunition, their artillery would fall silent. Without food, 300,000 men would go hungry. The railroads would not reach the front for weeks, perhaps months. The ports were wrecked. There was only one solution: trucks. Thousands of them, organized into a conveyor belt system that operated 24 hours per day without interruption. A mobile supply line that could extend as far as necessary and deliver tonnage in quantities sufficient to sustain offensive operations. Walsh had commandeered every available truck in the European theater of operations, had stripped units of their organic transport, had requisitioned newly arrived vehicles directly from the ships that brought them from America, had assembled a fleet of 6,000 trucks with the promise of more to come. He had designated highways as red ball routes, one-way roads reserved exclusively for supply convoys, and had banned all other traffic from these arteries. He had established control points every 50 miles with MPs and maintenance teams and fuel dumps so that trucks never stopped moving except to refuel or repair. He had created a schedule that treated trucks like railroad cars, with assigned departure times and expected arrival times and penalties for delays. He had recruited drivers from every unit in France, had pulled men from combat divisions and support battalions and service companies, had taken anyone who could operate a 2.5-ton truck and put them on the road with orders to drive until they could not stay awake and then drive some more. The statistics were now posted on the wall beside the map, updated every 6 hours by a staff sergeant who collected reports from control points and supply dumps and translated them into numbers that Walsh studied with the obsession of a man whose career and reputation depended on those numbers continuing to increase. August 15th, the current date, marked the operation's 12th day, and the numbers read like a fever dream of industrial logistics. 89,000 tons delivered since operations began, averaging 7,400 tons per day, with peaks exceeding 12,000 tons on days when Third Army's advance demanded maximum effort. 5,892 trucks currently operating on red ball routes, driving a combined total of over 1 million miles per week. fuel consumption of the convoy itself running at 280,000 gallons per day, which meant that roughly one truck in every 20 carried fuel for the other 19 trucks plus itself. An overhead cost that would have been prohibitive in any conventional calculation, but which Walsh had accepted as necessary because the alternative was not moving supplies at all. Behind Walsh, Major Robert Chen, no relation to the driver sleeping somewhere on the highway, was briefing a visiting delegation from Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Forces, explaining the route management system with the aid of charts and graphs that reduce the chaos of war to neat lines and columns. Each truck makes one round trip every 48 hours, Chen was saying, his pointer tapping against a diagram. Load at the beach depots. Drive 340 miles to forward dumps. Unload. Return empty, reload. The cycle repeats continuously. We calculate that each truck delivers approximately 6 tons per trip, making 12 tons per truck per week. Times 6,000 trucks gives us 72,000 tons per week capacity, which exceeds Third Army's current consumption rate with margin for expansion. One of the visiting officers, a British brigadier with North Africa ribbons on his chest, raised a hand. And when Third Army advances beyond your current forward dumps? When the distance becomes 400 miles, then 500? Does the system simply collapse under its own weight? Walsh turned from the map to answer, we extend the routes, we add more trucks. We establish intermediate transfer points where cargo can be handed off from long-haul trucks to short-haul trucks operating in relays. The system is not elegant, brigadier, but it is scalable. As long as we have trucks and fuel and roads and drivers, we can deliver supplies to any point in France. The German officer sat across the table from Captain Michael Brennan, with the rigid posture of a man determined to maintain dignity under circumstances that stripped dignity away. And when he spoke, his English was precise and accented with the careful pronunciation of someone who had learned the language from textbooks rather than conversation. His name was Hauptmann Friedrich Diehl. He had commanded a company in the 352nd Infantry Division, and he had been captured near Metz 6 days earlier when his unit, surrounded and out of ammunition, had chosen surrender over annihilation. Brennan had interviewed 40 German prisoners in the past 3 weeks, and Diehl was different from most of them only in his willingness to discuss logistics rather than simply providing name, rank, and serial number. You wish to know why we believed you would fail, Diehl said, responding to Brennan's question about German intelligence assessments of American supply capabilities. It is simple mathematics. An army the size of Third Army requires approximately 700 tons of supplies per day per division to maintain offensive operations. General Patton commands 12 divisions. Some armored, some infantry, all moving rapidly. This means a minimum of 8,000 tons per day. More likely 10,000 tons given the tempo of operations and the fuel consumption of armored divisions. You left your railheads 200 miles behind in mid-August. Your ports were destroyed. Your supply lines crossed territory we had spent 4 years preparing to deny to an invading force. By all conventional calculation, your advance should have halted in late August for lack of fuel and ammunition. Brennan nodded and made a note on his pad. Though he was recording the conversation and the note-taking was mostly to give Diehl the impression of importance, to encourage him to continue talking. But we didn't halt. No, Diehl said, and something like wonder crept into his voice. You did not halt. You accelerated. We received reports of American tank columns reaching the Moselle River, 350 miles from Normandy, and these reports seemed impossible because the fuel required to move armored divisions that distance, and that quickly exceeded any realistic assessment of your transport capacity. Our intelligence analysts concluded the reports were exaggerated, that your actual advance was more modest, that the Americans were engaging in deception to create panic. Then our own reconnaissance confirmed the reports. Your tanks were where your propaganda claimed they were, and they were still moving, still fighting, still consuming ammunition and fuel in quantities that defied explanation. Diehl leaned forward slightly, and Brennan saw that the German officer was not recounting facts, but working through a puzzle that still troubled him. Even in captivity, we knew about your truck convoys. Our aerial reconnaissance photographed your red ball routes before the Luftwaffe lost air superiority completely. We counted vehicles, estimated tonnage, calculated delivery capacity. The numbers were large but not impossible. 5,000 trucks, 6,000 trucks, with each carrying perhaps 6 tons, and operating on schedules that assumed perfect conditions and no breakdowns and no delays. We calculated that such a system might deliver 7,000 tons per day if everything worked perfectly. Which of course it never does in war. 7,000 tons per day is adequate to sustain defensive operations or limited offensives, but not a general advance across half of France. And yet we managed exactly that, Brennan said. And yet you managed exactly that, Deal repeated, which means either our calculations were catastrophically wrong, or your system operates at efficiencies we considered impossible, or you have resources we did not detect. I have spent the past 6 days attempting to determine which of these explanations is correct. He paused, and when he spoke again his voice carried the flat tone of a man reciting an unpleasant truth. I believe the answer is all three. Brennan waited, and Deal continued without prompting. Our calculations assumed that motor transport over long distances consumes nearly as much fuel as it delivers, particularly when roads are congested and vehicles are pushed to operate continuously. This is true for German logistics, where fuel is scarce and truck maintenance is poor, and drivers are often inadequately trained. But I have observed your supply operations since my capture. Your trucks are standardized, all the same model, which simplifies maintenance and part supply. Your drivers are skilled and disciplined. Your roads are managed with traffic control that prevents congestion. Your maintenance facilities are positioned at intervals that allow repairs without removing trucks from service for extended periods. Most critically, you waste fuel deliberately because you have so much of it that efficiency is less important than speed. The German officer's hands moved on the table, sketching invisible diagrams to illustrate his points. A German supply column conserves fuel by driving slowly, by reducing the number of trips, by carrying maximum loads that strain engines and cause frequent breakdowns. An American supply column burns fuel extravagantly by maintaining constant speed, by running trucks partially loaded if necessary to meet schedules, by operating vehicles 24 hours per day with drivers working in shifts. The German approach minimizes fuel consumption but delivers less tonnage. The American approach maximizes tonnage delivery and treats fuel consumption as an overhead cost to be accepted rather than minimized. This works only if you have unlimited fuel, which apparently you do. Brennan thought about the fuel figures he had seen in briefings at SHAEF headquarters. Numbers so large they became abstract. Petroleum products arriving in Europe at a rate of 1 million gallons per day by late summer, with tanker convoys from America maintaining a continuous flow despite U-boat attacks, with refineries in the United States expanding production specifically to support the European campaign, with fuel dumps in England holding reserves measured in tens of millions of gallons. The smell of engine oil and hot metal filled the cavernous garage that had once housed the vehicles of French aristocrats and now served as a maintenance facility for American trucks that operated beyond the recommended service intervals, beyond the expected duty cycles, beyond anything the manufacturers in Detroit had designed them to endure. Master Sergeant Earl Thompson walked down the line of GMC trucks with hoods raised and engines exposed, checking the work of mechanics who labored in shifts around the clock to keep the Red Ball Express running. And he carried with him a clipboard thick with maintenance reports that documented the cost of operating a logistical system at the edge of mechanical tolerance. In the past 45 days, Thompson's depot had processed 1,100 trucks requiring major repairs, had replaced 4,800 spark plugs, had rebuilt 730 engines, had installed 940 new transmissions, had changed oil in trucks that came through the rotation every 72 hours whether they needed it or not because preventive maintenance was cheaper than catastrophic failure somewhere on the highway between Normandy and the German border. The depot operated 6 bays simultaneously, each bay staffed by a team of 4 mechanics plus a parts runner. And the teams worked with the speed of men who understood that every hour a truck spent in repair was an hour it was not delivering supplies to the front. Thompson stopped beside a truck where Corporal Danny Martinez was installing a new fuel pump, and he checked his clipboard against the vehicle's bumper number. "This one came through here 9 days ago with a cracked engine block," Thompson said. "We put in a rebuilt engine. Now the fuel pump?" Martinez looked up from his work, his hands black with grease to the wrists. The engine's fine, Sarge. Purrs like a kitten. But they've been running these trucks so hard the fuel pumps are failing from vibration stress. This is the third pump I've replaced today. He gestured toward a pile of failed components in the corner of the bay. Look at those. Metal fatigue. Every one of them. These trucks are designed for maybe 8 hours of operation per day with rest periods. Red Ball runs them 22 hours out of 24. 2 hours down for refueling and driver change. The parts can't handle it. Thompson made a note on his clipboard and moved to the next bay where a complete engine swap was underway. The old engine hanging from a chain hoist while two mechanics guided a replacement unit into position. The system his depot had developed was brutally simple. Diagnose problems quickly, replace rather than repair when possible. Keep a massive inventory of parts and complete assemblies. Prioritize speed over elegance. A truck that would have spent 3 days in a conventional maintenance facility was back on the road in 8 hours. And if that meant replacing components that could have been repaired, if that meant higher parts consumption and greater waste, those were acceptable costs because the alternative was reducing the number of trucks available for convoy duty. The parts inventory filled a warehouse that had once stored furniture for the Palace of Versailles. And Thompson had walked through it yesterday morning doing a physical count that left him shaking his head in amazement. 1,200 complete engines in wooden crates, stacked 4 high, 800 transmissions, 3,000 wheels and tires, enough spark plugs to fill a railroad box car, enough oil filters to build a wall, mountains of nuts and bolts and gaskets and belts and hoses and electrical components, all organized by part number and stock location, all tracked in ledgers maintained by a sergeant who had worked as an accountant in civilian life and who treated inventory management with the seriousness of a man balancing corporate books. The Red Ball Express consumed parts at a rate that would have bankrupted a civilian trucking company within weeks. But the Army simply shipped more parts from America, added them to the inventory, distributed them to maintenance depots like Thompson's, where mechanics installed them in trucks that rolled back onto the highways and continued hauling supplies until the next component failed and the cycle repeated. It was logistics supporting logistics, a recursive loop where the system existed to sustain itself as much as to deliver cargo. And Thompson had stopped trying to calculate whether it made economic sense because economic sense was not the point. The point was keeping Third Army mobile, and if that required replacing fuel pumps every 9 days and engines every 6 weeks and entire trucks every 4 months, then that was what they would do. At the far end of the garage, a truck pulled in with smoke pouring from under its hood, and Thompson jogged over to assess the damage. The driver, a sergeant from Mississippi whose name tape read Walker, climbed out of the cab and spat on the concrete floor. Radiator's gone? Started boiling over about 10 miles back, but I nursed her here because stopping on the highway gets you written up. Thompson popped the hood and confirmed the diagnosis. The radiator had developed a split seam and lost all its coolant, and the engine had overheated to the point where the metal glowed faintly even now. This engine's cooked, he said. We'll swap in a new one. 4 hours and you'll be back on the road. Walker nodded as if engine swaps were routine maintenance, which for Red Ball drivers they had become. How many trucks you got in here now? Thompson glanced around the garage, counting quickly. 23 in for service. Another 40 waiting outside. We'll process maybe 60 trucks today. 70 if we get lucky and don't hit any complicated problems. And this is just one depot? One of 7 along the route. Thompson confirmed. Plus mobile maintenance teams that handle minor repairs at the control points. The system's designed so a truck never has to travel more than 50 miles to reach a maintenance facility. He pulled a rag from his pocket and wiped oil from his hands, a futile gesture given that his hands had not been truly clean since August. You know what the brass told me when they set this up? They said to think of it like a factory production line. Trucks are the product. Our job is quality control. Keep them running, get them back in service. Don't worry about the cost. The overhead lights in the concrete bunker 40 feet beneath the Bendler block hummed with the high-pitched whine of generators struggling under load. And in their harsh fluorescent glow, General Major Otto Reinhardt studied the intelligence summary that represented 2 months of painstaking analysis of American logistics operations in France. The document ran to 63 pages of typed text, supplemented by photographs, captured manifests, interrogation transcripts, and statistical tables compiled from every available source. And its conclusion was stated in the opening paragraph with a directness that made Reinhardt wish the analyst had buried the finding deeper in the report, where it might have escaped immediate attention. American motor transport operations have achieved sustained delivery rates exceeding 14,000 tons per day to forward combat units, a figure representing twice the Wehrmacht's maximum logistical capacity during offensive operations on any front and 3 times our current capability given fuel shortages and vehicle losses. This disparity in supply throughput constitutes a strategic advantage against which tactical or operational skill cannot prevail. Reinhardt had served in logistics for 28 years, had organized supply operations for 3 army groups, had calculated tonnage requirements for campaigns from Poland to the Caucasus, and he had believed that his experience gave him an understanding of what was possible in military logistics and what was fantasy. The Red Ball Express violated everything he thought he knew. It operated at distances that should have made motor transport prohibitively inefficient. It delivered tonnages that should have required railroad networks. It sustained operations that should have collapsed under their own complexity. And it did all of this not as a temporary emergency measure but as standard procedure. Week after week, with a consistency that suggested the Americans had found a way to industrialize logistics itself, to turn supply into a manufacturing process as reliable as factory production. The statistics filled page after page of the report, and Reinhardt read them with the growing horror of a man watching his professional certainties dissolve. The Red Ball Express at its peak had operated 6,140 trucks on dedicated routes totaling over 1,000 miles of one-way highway. Those trucks had made an average of 1 round trip every 48 hours, delivering 6.2 tons per trip, generating a throughput of approximately 19,000 truck trips per week, carrying 118,000 tons of supplies. Fuel consumption of the convoy itself had reached 350,000 gallons per day, meaning the Americans burned more fuel operating their supply trucks than the entire Wehrmacht currently allocated to Army Group B on the Western Front. Maintenance requirements had consumed 4,000 replacement engines, 12,000 transmissions, 38,000 tires, and spare parts in quantities that the analyst had simply listed as industrial-scale, precise figures unavailable. The human cost of the operation was documented in a separate section: drivers working in shifts with minimal rest, accident rates climbing as fatigue accumulated, maintenance crews operating around the clock, traffic control personnel managing convoy movements with the precision of railroad dispatchers. The Americans had committed approximately 23,000 personnel to Red Ball operations, not counting the quartermaster troops who loaded and unloaded trucks at depots. And they had accepted casualty rates from accidents and exhaustion that a German commander would have considered excessive. But the casualties were acceptable because the system worked, because it delivered the tonnage, because it kept 3rd Army and 1st Army and 7th Army supplied despite distances and difficulties that should have made sustained offensive operations impossible. Reinhardt turned to the section analyzing why the Wehrmacht could not replicate the American system even if vehicles and fuel were available. And here the report became almost philosophical in its assessment. German logistics, the analyst argued, was based on a fundamentally different conception of resources and efficiency. German planners assumed scarcity and therefore optimized for conservation, for making limited resources stretch as far as possible, for careful rationing and prioritization. American planners assumed abundance and therefore optimized for throughput, for moving maximum tonnage regardless of overhead costs, for accepting waste as the price of speed. A German supply system used fewer vehicles operating more efficiently over longer periods. An American supply system used more vehicles operating less efficiently, but delivering more total cargo, because the vehicles themselves were treated as consumable resources, to be used hard and replaced when they wore out. The fundamental difference, the report concluded, was industrial capacity. Germany's factories produced approximately 15,000 military trucks per year, operating under Allied bombing and fuel shortages and raw material constraints. American factories produced 500,000 military trucks per year, and this disparity meant that Americans could afford to waste trucks in ways that Germans could not. could afford to run them beyond rated capacity and replace them when they failed, could afford to dedicate thousands of vehicles to a single logistics operation, because thousands more were arriving from factories in Detroit and Chicago and Cleveland every week. The war had become a contest not of military skill but of industrial output. And in that contest, Germany had already lost even if the armies had not yet stopped fighting. Reinhardt closed the report and sat in silence, listening to the generator hum and the distant rumble of what might have been Allied bombers over the city, or might have been his imagination. He thought about Major Klaus Brenner, who had submitted the first intelligence assessment of the Red Ball Express back in September, and whose skepticism had been vindicated by events. He thought about the truck columns stretching across France, mechanical rivers flowing day and night, an industrial heartbeat pumping supplies to armies that advanced because they never ran out of fuel or ammunition or food. He thought about the German soldiers retreating eastward, fighting skillfully and bravely and uselessly against an enemy whose advantage was not courage or training, but simply the mathematical inevitability of greater resources applied without restraint or hesitation. The war would not end with a decisive battle or a brilliant strategy or a heroic last stand. It would end when the American industrial machine ground German resistance down to nothing. When the trucks delivered so many supplies that German defensive positions became irrelevant. When the weight of materiel made tactics meaningless, Reinhardt had spent a career believing that logistics was the hidden foundation of warfare, the unglamorous but essential work that made victory possible. Now he understood that logistics could be victory itself, that the side which solved the problem of supply solved the problem of war, that the Red Ball Express and systems like it represented a new kind of warfare where abundance defeated scarcity not through better application, but through sheer, overwhelming volume. He thought of that first photograph Major Brenner had studied, the one showing trucks extending to the horizon. Not tactics, but the industrial inevitability of supply. Not generals, but the mathematics of tonnage per day. Not heroism, but the prosaic brutality of 6,000 trucks running 24 hours every day until the enemy collapsed under the weight of delivered materiel. The Red Ball Express had been mockery transformed into nightmare. A system so excessive it seemed wasteful until you understood that waste was the point. That abundance itself was the weapon. That the Americans had turned logistics into a bludgeon and struck with it until German defenses shattered not from the blow but from exhaustion. From the simple impossibility of fighting an enemy who could afford to be inefficient because efficiency was no longer necessary when resources were effectively infinite. Outside the bunker, in the ruined city above, the generators continued their high-pitched whine. Burning fuel Germany could barely spare to power lights, illuminating reports about an enemy who burned fuel as if the earth produced it without limit. And somewhere in France, on roads reserved for a purpose the Wehrmacht had mocked and then feared and finally accepted as inevitable. The trucks rolled on through the darkness, their headlights blazing, their engines roaring, carrying the mathematics of industrial war toward a conclusion written not in strategy but in statistics. Not in valor, but in volume. Not in brilliance, but in the relentless, mechanical abundance of a nation that had turned supply itself into supremacy. It was the mathematics of surplus over scarcity, and scarcity had already lost.